일도 열심히 하지만 술도 열심히 마시는 민족. 밤에도 활발히 움직이는 민족. 스포츠에 하나 되는 민족. 미소가 없지만 친절한 민족. 빨리빨리. 이 문장들은 외국인들이 보는 한국인의 특징 5가지라고 합니다. 우리는 자주 한국인답다라는 말을 접하곤 하는데요. 최근에는 외국인들의 입을 통해 더 많이 한국인다운 것에 대한 이야기를 전해 듣곤 하죠. 그렇다면 역사적, 학문적으로 한국인은 어떤 특징을 가지고 있을까요? 미국 하버드 대학교에서 아시아 관계학을 연구한 우드 아르네베스타 예일대학교 역사학과 교수는 지난 몇 세기간 한국인들은 국가 문제를 이로움 중심으로 접근했다는 발표를 한 바 있습니다. 이 발표에서 베스타 교수는 중국을 제국으로 한국을 의로운 국가로 지칭했는데요. 베스타 교수는 한국이 외세의 침략과 간섭으로 룩진, 무척이나 험난한 역사를 겪어왔지만 항상 그것을 극복하고 더 크게 발전할 수 있었던 건 한국인들의 응집력에서 비롯됐다고 정의합니다. 그리고 아주 오래전부터 한국인만이 지닌 놀라운 특징 때문에 국난을 극복하는 능력이 생겨났다고 전했는데요. 그는 어떻게 한국이 결코 중국에 편입되지 않고 오랜 역사를 이어 지금의 한국을 이루어냈는지에 대해 궁금증을 풀고자 한중 관계의 과거와 현재를 더 깊이 연구하게 되었다고 합니다. 유독 베스타 교수가 한국에 관심을 갖는 이유와 한국을 역사 속에서 의로운 국가라고 칭하게 되었는지 인터뷰를 통해 함께 알아보시죠.
Today we'll talk with him about his forthcoming book, Empire and Righteous Nation, 600 Years of China-Korea Relations. Welcome, Professor Westad.
It's great to be here.
So let's begin with an overview of the book. Tell us about it.
So this is a book that started as a set of lectures that I gave at Harvard 2 years ago, where I tried to provide an overview of the relationship between China and Korea over a long period of time, to sort of try to get to the essence of what that relationship is like. So it started very much from the idea of the centrality, the significance of that particular relationship today. I think whatever happens in the future, relations between China and Korea are going to be pretty important for the international community. And then
why Korea and China? What led you to focus on that relationship?
So two things really. I mean, one I mentioned already, it's the contemporary significance of that relationship. So everyone now is preoccupied what's going to happen on the Korean peninsula. We are concerned about the North Korean nuclear program and where that would be heading. We're concerned in general about security relationships in Northeast Asia. So that was one starting point for this. And of course, China is by far the most significant neighbor of Korea. But then there was also a preoccupation with how this has worked through history. So Korea is a small country, bordering a country that for most of its existence has been an empire, China in its various imperial incarnations.
Right.
And I was quite eager to try to find out a bit more about how that relationship had worked. So for instance, why was Korea never incorporated into the Chinese empire? Why was it always distinct? Why did it have a very clear, specific identification of being outside of the empire? That's an interesting question, I think, in the broad sense.
Yes, yes. So how did you do the research?
So this is a book where I started by giving the lectures, and then I figured out how little I actually knew about much of this. So then I did what I usually do when I write a book. I go back to reading, and in this case, mainly what others have written about this, people who know the different periods of the Sino-Korean relationship much better than what I do. For a relatively brief period which deals with the early 20th century, I also looked at some of the document collections that are available. And then I spoke to a lot of people about their work on the past, but also people who are dealing with Sino-Korean relations today. So I spoke with policymakers and officials in Seoul and in Beijing. And I also gave an early version of these lectures in both of the capitals, so both in Beijing and Seoul, and had the reaction from their scholars and their officials. Okay. For many Chinese, Korea is a little bit different because it has been a neighbor for China for millennia. It is so close that young Chinese now who watch South Korean television series of various sorts, their reaction is, these people are foreign, but they're almost like us.
Right.
And that preoccupation, I think, was a bit surprising to me, how close that relationship is seen as being. And on the Korean side, in terms of Chinese culture and the origins, the common origins, which I write quite a bit about in the book, of Chinese and Korean culture.
Okay, so let's talk about how the relationship, how Korea's relationship with China did develop over the course of 600 years and how it did remain separate from it. So why do you think that China never brought them into the fold of their empire?
So I think there are two main reasons why it never happened. The first one, which I explore in the book, is the development of what you could, with a slightly anachronistic term, call Korean nationalism. So at least, this is my argument in the book, at least from the late 16th century, there is a very clear Korean identity, which is connected to the culture as it had developed during the Ming in China, but is still separate from it. And it comes pretty close, I argue, building on the work of historians of Korea that have worked on this before, very close to what in the 19th century and early 20th century in Europe you would call a nation. That's quite unique in many ways, but that identity is important. And then secondly, I think on the Ming side and later on the Qing Empire that took over from the Ming in the early 17th century, there was this idea of Korea as a symbolic ally, as a model ally in a way, a model vassal, a state that aligned itself with whatever power was in control of China, and therefore had to some extent earned the right to be separate from it. It didn't have to be disciplined. It didn't have to be brought into the empire and told by the emperor, stop misbehaving, live like us, because in a way they already did that.
Right. Was there a certain level of respect, do you think, between the two countries?
I think there was a great deal of respect. Now, of course, on the Korean side, on the Joseon side, one always had to be very careful. Living next to an empire is always difficult and sometimes very dangerous. And I think the Korean leaders during the Joseon state developed a number of ideas about how they could handle that relationship with the Chinese empires, with the Ming and later on the Qing. Always be respectful, but also always be very cautious with regard to how you dealt with the empire next door. For instance, the Koreans became masters of knowing much more about the empire than the empire knew about them.
Wow.
They were extremely good at taking advantage of the ritual visits that they carried out, the so-called tribute missions, to Beijing, figuring out what was important for the empire, what was discussed there. They were, you could put it in modern terms, you could say they were really good at intelligence work. And all of this was reported back to Korea, and therefore the Korean kings knew how to react when different kinds of initiatives came out of the Chinese side. I mean, first and foremost, the understanding, as we've touched upon already, of just how hard it is to live next door to one of the world's megastates. I mean, how you handle that. And I think this is a challenge today for both parts of Korea, both North and South, in terms of developing, especially as China rises in terms of international affairs and become more significant on a global scale. They have to figure out, how do we deal with that relationship? How do we deal with it in terms of the economic aspects, the political aspects, the military strategic aspects, even the cultural aspects.
Sure.
And on this, I think there is a great deal of learning that can be had from history. You have to be very careful, very cautious in terms of how you do it. But on the other hand, you cannot live a life that is based on excluding the empire that is next door. It has to be brought in. So one of the big lessons, I think, from history is that there won't be a solution to the division of Korea, which I think is what is needed in order to avoid the kind of security dilemma that we have at the moment, without a very strong Chinese involvement. So China will have to be an active participant in that process, a positive participant in that process. Without it, it is very unlikely that it will succeed.
And why do you think China needs to play that role specifically, and how best for it to do so?
Well, so two questions. So the first one is simply because of the location of China, its significance in terms of its economic growth and the growth in its power. As I show in the book, this has always been the case, with exception of a few periods in which China has been weak and divided. China has been the big guy in that region, right? So you have to take that into consideration when you find a more positive solution. The second one is what I hope that China will be moving towards, which is a more positive relationship to Korea as a whole, and first and foremost to South Korea. And China has come a long way. I mean, less than a generation ago, China and South Korea were enemies. Now they trade with each other. They sometimes have disagreements. But there is a great deal of respect among younger Chinese for the achievements in Korea, economic achievements, but also an admiration for what an open, pluralistic society South Korea actually is. So I hope that the Chinese government will continue to move along that line of linking what is going to happen in terms of the relationship on the Korean Peninsula. So what I really worry about with regard to Korea is not just the tension that exists at the moment. The problem with the situation in Korea is that it could lead to war. I mean, it's one of the few situations on a global scale which could easily, by mistakes being made here or in Pyongyang or in Beijing or in Seoul, lead to a cataclysmic war,
Right.
with consequences far beyond anything that most of us would regard as imaginable. And that's the reason why it's so important to try to reduce tension now, with the ideal being that at some point in the future the two parts of Korea would come together again in the united Korea, which has been the situation for almost all of Korean's history since the time that I start out discussing.
So in terms of you looking at the history of this region, do you think that that could possibly be likely?
Yes, I think Korea will be reunified at some point. I don't know the circumstances under which it would happen. Of course, I hope it would happen sooner rather than later. But it's very rare in human history, if you look at it overall, that an artificially divided country, and particularly a country with that strong a sense of national identity, which I talk about in the book, remain divided for a very long period of time. Now, we can explain why that has happened historically, and I try to do that in the book. But for it to become a forever phenomenon, I think is very, very unlikely. So this is, again, often what happens in history. We say that something cannot be achieved until it suddenly happens. Right? And that's the lesson, of course, from Europe after the Cold War. It's also the lessons that we draw in a number of other historical cases going further back. There is something about something that belongs together in a cultural sense being put back together when the possibilities exist for doing that domestically and internationally. I'm pretty sure that will.
이상 꿀튜브였습니다. 이번 영상이 도움되셨다면 구독, 좋아요 눌러주세요. 앞으로도 꿀튜브 채널에 많은 관심 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.